Hello everyone, I'm Brazen Eagle, and thank you for joining me here. So, today we're going to continue reading The Fate of Empires and the Search for Survival by Sir John Glubb. So, we're going to begin with number 9, USA, in the stage of the pioneers. In the case of the United States of America, the pioneering period did not consist of a barbarian conquest of an effete civilization, but of the conquest of barbarian peoples. Thus, viewed from the outside, every example seems to be different. But viewed from the standpoint of the great nation, every example seems to be similar. The United States arose, suddenly, as a new nation, and its period of pioneering was spent in the conquest of a vast continent, not an ancient empire. Yet the subsequent life history of the United States has followed the standard pattern which we shall attempt to trace, the periods of the pioneers, of commerce, of affluence, of intellectualism, and of decadence. Number 10. Commercial expansion. The conquest of vast areas of land and their subjugation to one government automatically acts as a stimulant to commerce. Both merchants and goods can be exchanged over considerable distances. Moreover, if the empire be an extensive one, it will include a great variety of climates, producing extremely varied products, which the different areas will wish to exchange with one another. The speed of modern methods of transportation tends to create in us the impression that far-flung commerce is a modern development, but this is not the case. Objects made in Ireland, Scandinavia, and China have been found in the graves or the ruins of the Middle East, dating from 1,000 years before Christ. The means of transport were slower, but when a great empire was in control, commerce was freed from the innumerable shackles imposed upon it today by passports, import permits, customs, boycotts, and political interference. The Roman Empire extended from Britain to Syria and Egypt, a distance, in a direct line of perhaps 2,700 miles. A Roman official transferred from Britain to Syria might spend 6 months on the journey. However, throughout the whole distance, he would be traveling in the same country with the same official language, the same laws, the same currency, and the same administrative system. Today, some 20 independent countries separate Britain from Syria, each with its own government, its own laws, politics, customs, fees, passports, and currencies, making commercial cooperation almost impossible. And this process is disintegration is still continuing. Even within the small areas of the modern European nations, provincial movements demanding secession or devolution tend further to splinter this continent. The present fashion for independence has produced great numbers of tiny states in the world, some of them consisting of only one city or of a small island. This system is an insuperable obstacle to trade and cooperation. The present European Economic Community is an attempt to secure commercial cooperation among small independent states over a large area, but the plan meets with many difficulties, due to the mutual jealousies of so many nations. Even savage and militaristic empires promoted commerce, whether they intended to or not. The Mongols were some of the most brutal military conquerors in history, massacring entire populations of cities. Yet in the 13th century, when the empire extended from Peking to Hungary, the caravan trade between China and Europe achieved a remarkable degree of prosperity. The whole journey was in the territory of a single government. In the 8th and 9th centuries, the caliphs of Baghdad achieved famous wealth owing to the immense extent of their territories, which constituted a single trade bloc. The empire of the caliphs is now divided into some 25 separate nations. Number 11. The pros and cons of empires. In discussing the life story of the typical empire, we've digressed into a discussion of whether empires are useful or injurious to mankind. We seem to have discovered that empires have certain advantages, particularly in the field of commerce and in the establishment of peace and security in vast areas of the globe. Perhaps we should also include the spread of varied cultures to many races. The present infatuation for independence for even smaller and smaller units will eventually, doubtlessly, be succeeded by new international empires. The present attempts to create a European community may be regarded as a practical endeavor to constitute a new superpower in spite of the fragmentation resulting from the craze for independence. If it succeeds, some of the local independencies will have to be sacrificed. If it fails, the same result may be attained by military conquest or by the partition of Europe between rival superpowers. The inescapable conclusion seems, however, to be that larger territorial units are a benefit to commerce and to public stability, whether the broader territory will be achieved by voluntary association or by military action. And finally, point 12, sea power. One of the more benevolent ways in which a superpower can promote peace and commerce is by its command of the sea. From Waterloo to 1914, the British Navy commanded the seas of the world. Britain grew rich, but she also made the seas safe for the commerce of all nations and prevented major wars for about 100 years. Curiously enough, the question of sea power was never clearly distinguished in British politics during the last 50 years from the question of imperial rule over other countries. In fact, the two subjects are entirely distinct. Sea power does not offend small countries as does military occupation. If Britain had maintained her navy with a few naval bases overseas in isolated islands and had given independence to colonies which asked for it, the world might be a, more stable place today. In fact, however, the navy was swept away in the popular outcry against imperialism. So, and that is where we're going to leave it. Leave the essay. So, Sir John Glubb recognizes, earlier on in point 9, that the United States did not become a great power by destroying an old civilization, but through conquering what he calls barbarian peoples. We did this, Americans did this through the idea of course, manifest destiny. And that's the main difference between the US and other empires, at least in the beginning stages. There was no old dying civilization for us to basically take over. It was different groups of people that were too weak and technologically backwards that couldn't resist the might of progress. So, and because nowadays, or in the ancient days, great empires usually conquered great stretches of land, commerce can greatly expand, right? Just makes sense. If the empire or great power becomes large enough, then there will be different climates, which produces different goods. Then these goods can be traded across the empire and increase the commerce and wealth of a nation. Sounds pretty good, right? But since the beginning of man, transporting goods across the world has occurred. Like what Sir John Glubb states, materials from China and Ireland were both found in the Middle East thousands of years ago. Of course, transporting things back then was slower than today, but there are fewer countries that needed goods to go through to get to their destination. The quicker the goods can be exchanged, the more money you make, right? And it helps if there's less barriers to entry to transport goods. Sir John Glubb brings up that during the time of the Roman Empire, people could trade from the British Isles to North Africa while retaining the same laws, official language, currency, and administrative system. In today's world, there are numerous countries that occupy the same territory of the Roman Empire. A large empire can, of course, make commerce easier than several smaller nations. Now, Sir John Glubb brings up the example of the European Economic Community, in which the European states are attempting to make it easier to economically cooperate and trade. But there are of course, issues because of the relations between nations. The more independent nations there are, like we've said before, the more difficult it can become to trade, especially if some of those nations hate each other, especially in the Balkans. Anyways, Sir John Glubb further goes on that even though military conquest might be the most important when actually establishing an empire, commerce can, of course, still flourish. He brings up the example of the Mongols, who literally massacred entire populations across Europe and Asia, but still managed to make some decent money when trading between China all the way to Hungary. Obviously, from Wikipedia here on the right, you can see the little graph of the extent of the Mongol Empire stretching out, becoming larger and larger, and I'll blow it up for the rest of us. So, they started, of course, near Mongolia. The Mongol Empire then decided to greatly expand all the way up to almost Finland, and then over close to Hungary here, and then basically eventually almost took over all of China, if not all of it already. Yeah, they took over all of China, parts of northern India, all of Persia, an insane amount of land that developed a pretty decent amount of wealth because of the land conquests. Now, Sir John Glubb brings up that empires have both pros and cons, like everything, and independence movements within empires or great powers can cause havoc. The European Union is attempting more and more to become more unified, on paper at least, despite the many different cultures, and if the EU actually wants to become a single nation, then the independence of each sovereign nation will cease to exist. We're seeing that right now. People don't want to be ruled by a bureaucracy from the EU. He concludes point 11 on page 8 here with the idea that larger territorial regions under a single government can bring in more commerce, wealth, and stability to the area, regardless if the people are conquered or voluntarily associate themselves with that group. Finally, we conclude with point 12, and that's sea power. Sea power helps promote peace and commerce. It helps keep the waterways to trade fairly calm, and sea power can also help project power to smaller and weaker countries. Through establishing sea power, it usually doesn't offend weaker countries like colonialism or military occupation. Makes sense. In order, though, to have peaceful global trade, it is up to a single powerful government or a collection of governments that agree to keep the seas safe and ultimately trade and wealth safe for everyone. Now, regardless, this is the conclusion of part 3 of the Fate of Empires series. This is definitely shorter than my other videos just because the next section, when we begin with the Age of Commerce, has a lot more to it. So the next video will be longer in respect to this video. So with that in mind, thank you very much for watching. I'm Brazen Eagle, and I hope you have a great day.